All right, welcome to the explainer. Let's just dive right into this. You know that feeling when you pour a beautiful glass of wine, take a sip, and expect these rich notes of dark cherry or crisp apple, but instead you get hit with something entirely unexpected? Well, today we're putting on our detective hats to investigate the chemical mysteries hiding right inside your wine glass. We're going to explore how the very grapes that make up your absolute favorite vintage can sometimes act as hidden chemical culprits, literally altering what you taste and smell. So let me ask you, have you ever tasted green bell pepper or honestly, maybe even a hint of wet dirt in your wine? Sounds totally bizarre, right? But it's actually incredibly common. You might have sat there wondering, did something go wrong here? Or is this exactly how it's supposed to taste? Well, those really specific, sometimes kind of jarring flavors, they don't just magically appear out of thin air. They're the result of some seriously complex chemical reactions and specific compounds harbored within the grapes themselves. To wrap our heads around this, we need to define our core term for the day, organoleptic alteration. Now, I know it sounds super technical, but it really just means modifications in the sensory properties of a wine, specifically how it smells and tastes, that originate directly from the grape's own chemical compounds and intrinsic characteristics. Because winemaking, it isn't just about letting grape juice sit around and ferment. It's an active, highly scientific battle to manage these organoleptic alterations. It's this delicate tightrope walk between achieving absolute enological excellence and falling into critical, unpalatable flaws. Section 1. The Great Herbaceous Debate, Freshness versus Flaw. Let's move to our first major flavor profile investigation. And this is where the line between a delightful characteristic and a totally ruined bottle gets, well, very blurry. Herbaceous notes are a classic double-edged sword in the winemaking world. On one side, you have the good herbal. Think about the freshness, the complexity you find in a young white wine, like a really crisp Sauvignon Blanc. Those subtle notes of freshly cut grass can be absolutely vibrant. But on the flip side, we have the bad herbal. These are the overpowering, aggressive vegetative notes. Like chewing on a raw green bell pepper or a massive handful of tarragon, showing up in contexts where they simply do not belong, completely throwing the entire aromatic profile out of whack. Now, what's really interesting here is seeing exactly how many variables dictate whether a wine ends up pleasantly fresh or aggressively green. It's definitely not just luck. It's a massive mix of environmental and process factors. For instance, harvesting grapes early, before full maturity, that traps those green notes. Environmental conditions like low sunlight and high humidity absolutely amplify them. And then, once you're actually in the winery, choices like low fermentation temperatures, a lack of oxygen exposure, or even really intense pressing of the grapes can extract and preserve these herbaceous flavors. Basically, every single human choice affects the final herbaceous outcome. And that brings us to our first chemical mugshot, pyrazines, specifically compounds like IBMP. Now, these aromatic compounds hang out directly in the grape skins, and they are the prime suspects behind those distinct green bell pepper and asparagus notes. So when you get that intense vegetative hit in a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Sauvignon Blanc, you aren't just tasting a vibe, you are literally tasting pyrazines. But pyrazines aren't the only ones shaping this profile. Let's look at another suspect, terpenes. With linalool being a chief contributor here, linalool brings all these floral, herbal, and citrus notes to the party. It's especially prominent in grape varieties like Muscat and Gewürztraminer. When it's balanced perfectly, it's beautifully aromatic. But when it's off, it can heavily skew the entire sensory experience. Section 2. Catching chemical contaminants. Unwanted intruders. All right, let's transition to a slightly more concerning mystery. Because sometimes the off flavors aren't natural to the grape at all. They are completely unnatural intruders. Have you ever picked up a hint of iodine or worse, plastic in your glass? Yikes. Let's trace how these unnatural flavors manage to infiltrate the wine. It's really a step-by-step contamination path. It can start right out in the vineyard. Things like excessive use of pesticides or herbicides can leave chemical residues directly on the grape skins. Then, during handling, rough transport can actually break the bunches, releasing all sorts of undesirable substances into the must. And finally, during storage and transport, the materials themselves can essentially turn on the wine. For example, using the wrong PVC hoses can literally leach plastic or rubber flavors right into the liquid. You see, winemaking is a highly sensitive process, and external chemicals are always looking for a sneaky way to hijack the flavor. So how does a winery actually fight back against this? Well, the winemaker's defense relies heavily on meticulous hygiene, strictly utilizing food-grade materials, and conducting really rigorous sensory and chemical analysis.
Preventing these chemical and iodine tastes requires the winemaker to step up and act as a super strict flavor manager. Early identification of problems and just extreme cleanliness, that's the only way to ensure the wine remains pristine.
Section 3. The taste of wet earth. Musty and damp flaws. Let's move on to our final and honestly perhaps most surprising flavor profile investigation. Notice the visual contrast we're showing here. A beautiful, perfect pour of wine right next to a bunch of grapes absolutely covered in morning dew. It looks totally idyllic, right? Almost romantic. But that moisture, that beautiful dew or rain on the grapes, is actually the starting point for some of the absolute most frustrating musty flaws in all of winemaking. The causes of these damp earth flavors are primarily environmental. Humid growth conditions basically give microorganisms and molds a free pass to thrive on the grape skins. If there's rain or heavy condensation right during the harvest, you are essentially importing wet, mold-friendly conditions straight into the winery. Add in the potential for contaminated containers or barrels, or even a prolonged maceration process where those grape skins sit in the juice for just a bit too long, and boom, you extract these intense, wildly undesirable flavors of damp soil and wet basement directly into the wine. So what is the ultimate culprit behind this wet dirt smell? Well, meet geosmin. This is a super powerful terpene produced by soil microorganisms. If the grapes come into contact with wet soil, or if there's an overgrowth of these microorganisms in a really humid vineyard, geosmin transfers right onto the grapes. And the human palate, it is incredibly sensitive to geosmin. Fun fact, it's the exact same compound that makes the air smell like wet dirt right after a rainstorm. But here's the thing. Geosmin rarely acts alone. It has accomplices. Compounds like pyrazines, which we saw earlier contributing to those green flavors, can also lend some earthy aromas. Furthermore, sulfur compounds, particularly hydrogen sulfide or H2S, can team up to create these sulfurous, wet, earthy, and mineral odors. Together, they create an aromatic profile that completely masks the beautiful fruit notes the winemaker worked so incredibly hard to cultivate. Section 4. Perfecting the perfect pour. Preventing flaws. All right. Now that we've identified the suspects, let's see how this all builds into our conclusion. The absolute crucial point here is that the battle against bad flavors is actually won out in the vineyard, long before the grapes ever reach the press. Through smart agronomic practices, viticulturists can prevent these flaws from day one. This means doing things like choosing well-drained vineyard sites so moisture doesn't pool up. It means proper pruning of the vines to ensure good air circulation, which keeps the grapes dry and mold-free. It requires strict dry condition harvesting, like literally waiting for the dew to dry before picking. And of course, uncompromising equipment disinfection. Which brings us to this overarching truth from our source material. Winemaking is a process that combines numerous factors and variables to transform grapes into wine. It sounds simple on paper, but as we've seen today, it's an incredibly complex equation. A grape's intrinsic chemical compounds are the absolute foundation of the whole operation. If managed well, they lead to pure oenological excellence. But if mismanaged, or if environmental factors completely take control, those exact same compounds result in critical flaws. Knowing all of this, honestly, completely changes the tasting experience. You aren't just tasting wine anymore, are you? You're tasting pyrazines, terpenes, and the direct results of a winemaker's meticulous hygiene. So next time you take a sip, which hidden chemical character will you detect first? Will it be the fresh grass of a perfectly balanced herbal note, or perhaps the faint, sneaky whisper of geosmin? Keep your senses sharp, flavor detectives.